Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I am going to hand over to Neil Hawkins, who is going to introduce our speaker today, Tim Disher. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Alida, and welcome, Tim and everybody. So I think I met Tim a few years ago at an ISPOR conference, and he was telling me about AI and systematic reviews, and I thought that sounded really interesting. And I've been meaning to try and arrange a seminar with him for some time, so I'm delighted he can join today. Your company is now Sandpiper Analytics. I think it was Loon or something at the time.
Yes, yeah, I was with Loon at the time. That's right.
Yeah. So I'm just going to hand over to you, Tim, to a little bit about yourself and about LLMs and reviews.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good talk. I've got about hopefully 30 minutes of content, and then I'm hoping for lots of good discussion. I recognize some of the names in the group here, so I think I know based on my conversations with them, we should have some good dialogue. So this is my overall goal by the end of the talk. I think I'm going to try to convince you all that we have a capability frontier in SLRs that's real, but it's doubly jagged. That'll make more sense in a moment, and it's moving faster than a lot of our traditional evaluation methods can track. I think that our traditional approaches to building trust in these tools are probably broken, and we need something new to help with that. I'm going to hope to convince you that you should be using some of these tools on every single review you're using, but that you need to match that integration to the context. And then lastly, if nobody here went to university with me, but I love qualitative work. I love philosophy, and so I'm going to end on something that I think is a little bit more of a philosophical note that I hope will spark some thinking of beyond just kind of the numbers that we gather. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on the capabilities themselves. There's a new JCE review that came out, I think, like 3 weeks ago in preprint, or 2 weeks ago by Lenino, that covers a lot of the main stuff around screening, extraction, risk of bias, those pieces at least. All of these are areas where people had published, at least in some form, some evaluations saying that the LLMs were helping them, that they were working. So from search, I think there's kind of limited evidence that I've seen, nothing that I really wanted to kind of bring up and talk about in depth. In screening, it's probably title and abstract and full text is where we've seen the most. I mean, there's a new screening article or title abstract article, it seems like every few weeks. The metrics here reported in Laniel were kind of the best. So they use positive predictive agreement. We can think of that as kind of sensitivity. Negative predictive agreement is kind of like a specificity. Very, very good as a median. A little bit of a wonky range that might make you think whether or not we should be using this entirely. Extraction as having kind of this like really broad accuracy that can be very high or can be very low. Risk of bias, the same sort of thing. I think there's a special problem in risk of bias that I'm going to talk about. Synthesis, I've seen a few papers on the use, like generating meta-analysis code. Personally, I'm not a huge, I don't think that's really the way we'll go. I think you can do a lot with deterministic stuff downstream once you have your data cleaned up and everything, and it'd be more about making decisions as opposed to writing kind of the same multi-NMA or meta R script over and over again. So narrative synthesis, generating forest plots and things, and then reporting has been the most limited in my experience. There's been some stuff on this in terms of I think I've seen from like Estima a few years back in Value and Health, but generally kind of the least amount. And so this is kind of consistent with what Laniolo saw, and this we'll come back to this a few times, which is that they have a lot of screening papers, so something like 53% were screening, 16% extraction, 9% ROB. So as we kind of get down that complexity gradient in terms of and how hard it is to think about a good job, whether or not you did a good job of something, we're seeing less and less actual publications in the space. Screening, just pulling it out as an example, is kind of the most mature, and some of the tools that I'm familiar with and kind of were the most impressive in terms of their breadth and depth of evaluation. So you have AutoSR, that's an end-to-end pipeline. So title abstract, full text, 96.7% sensitivity, 97.9. Synthesis Company, which is basically a clone of AutoSR based on their preprint. and then Loon Lens Pro, which is their own kind of thing, and they split it up in terms of title abstract and full text. But these are all great numbers. And yet, when I talk to people, there's still a lot of hesitation, and I think it's well earned to an extent. And this is kind of again highlighted again by Laniolo in that paper. So, were the evaluations comprehensive enough across different types of reviews or types of questions? Did they capture what happens when your picos are just kind of straight out of someone's Prospero versus like really capturing every edge case, giving a lot of examples, or is this like a very simple pico versus very complex? Did they capture whether the tool is working better if you're looking at kind of older areas? So I do a lot of work in neonatal pain myself. So we have a lot of scanned articles from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? We don't, is it performing well on those? We don't necessarily know. It's not kind of picked out. What about like uncropped poster booklets? So we see this a lot in the work in consulting I do, where your poster will be, you upload it, like the full text for the poster, and you're uploading just kind of maybe 50 posters or a full booklet. And is it actually performing well, or do you need to be cropping things? And then also I kind of think and reflect on whether we're moving the goalposts on the like on the buyer side or on the user side. Are we saying, okay, wait, yeah, now you've got this like great sensitivity, but like, is it sensitive enough here? Is it sensitive enough here? And is that the role of the developer to cover every one of those potential kind of edge cases and use cases for us, or is there some sort of middle ground? Some of the developers have kind of tried to get at this by creating like layers of guardrails, which I think is interesting. So they might not be able to cover every edge case, but maybe they can add like an ML, like a traditional machine learning layer on top that's helping do some aspect of the screening to help kind of improve those numbers or help you identify hard to screen abstracts or some of these edge cases. And then those guardrails themselves, like, are they evaluated, right? We get this kind of the waterfall of just things. You introduce this new thing, and then, okay, well, how's your performance? Now, how's your performance? It becomes a little overwhelming. And I think when we go to the harder tasks, maybe the more interesting tasks for a lot of us that are doing a lot of this work. So data extraction is one thing to say that you're doing a good job of extracting picos or summarizing outcome definitions in each trial. Maybe you're extracting binary outcome data. That's maybe a little bit harder. Maybe you're doing complex continuous outcomes. So you have like a hierarchy of things you're interested in. Maybe I want at least squared means is my preferred if it's available, but I'll accept a change from baseline and I'll accept a mean, like a final mean, but I don't want percent change because I don't want to have to try to think of how to combine these different things. Digitizing data from graphs where the data is right in it, that's one thing, right? Like hazard ratios from Kaplan-Meier curves, for example. But what about digitizing where you're actually like digitizing a line plot or you're digitizing a Kaplan-Meier curve? So all of these and these evaluations are called data extraction. And they're reported as accuracy in terms of data extraction. And they're often all just lumped together, like 98% accuracy. But like maybe 300 of those cases are extracting narrative pico elements, and only one or two are these hard issues where you might actually be, that's might be where you live in the hard issues where they're failing. And that kind of gets all lost in the wash. Risk of bias, just all over the place in terms of accuracy. And then I also personally wonder if we're usually measuring agreement with a human reviewer, and on things like Robbins or ROV 2.0, are there reviewers really that qualified? Like, I think we do need to think about like whether the human reviewers are actually good representations of like a actual skilled methodologist. Anyone can call themselves an experienced. They've done a lot of Cochrane reviews. It doesn't mean they've done a great job. It doesn't mean they've encountered complex studies. It doesn't mean the data set actually had complex studies. So human reviewers we know have generally bad agreement on a lot of these tools. So if we see really high agreement between a human and a LLM powered evaluation, does that mean anything, or are we just kind of accepting the lowest common denominator? Like, is everyone wrong, essentially? And then downstream, like meta-analysis, are we just going to end up with like a cookie cutter where no one's really And I think one thing that hasn't been evaluated at all is like, okay, you have this data, you have a research question, and now there's 20 or 30 paths that you could take to get there on the analysis point. And does an LLM choose the right or defensible or like an optimal and doesn't meet kind of the overall goals versus, I mean, I'm quite confident that if you give it a bunch of binary data, it'll know that it should do a binary meta-analysis and it'll do that. That's not really that interesting. Um, and then reporting just becomes like, how do you even evaluate it? Yes, like factual summaries and like, did it pull the right numbers? That's really good. But in terms of if we want these to actually be automated, which there are some people that are openly trying to go that way, are they engaging? Are they convincing? Do they meet like a strategic goal? Does it do real synthesis or just like summarize a bunch of stuff? And it's just a gigantic version of a table. The other problem is that new models are really coming way too quickly. And the easiest way I could show this was with this GPQA Diamond benchmark that's used by like all the big labs that captures AI performance on a set of PhD level science questions, so difficult questions. And so it's existed since 2023. Every 4 months on average, we get a new state of the art score on this one piece. And we get there's been 150 evaluations in total since 2023. And so this isn't always like a brand new model, but it could be like, it's like O1 mini high versus low versus O1 high, and like the different levels of what you're getting. And when people are building these tools, they're thinking in terms of like, do I need to use GPT 5.1, 5.4 now we're at Pro for everything? Or can I use high? Or can I use low? Or can I sometimes use a cheap like Gemini 2.5, like older model to do things like OCR? There's so many choices, right? And even just this on its own, we can't really match this pace with publication. Like that Lanulo paper, 2026, it's all based on 2025, right? So January 2025 is when they stopped. So everything that's come after that is not actually captured in the evaluation. So we don't really know what the true capabilities are. We know what you can do with the old stuff, but just because you weren't successful before doesn't mean you can't be successful now. So there's this model frontier. The other problem is that we now have this whole new class of like agent harnesses. So things like Claude Code, Claude Cowork, OpenAI Codex, where they're capable of much more persistent planning and doing things on their own and going towards like a targeted goal. So now a lot of people can build their own tools. And I know for sure that like most big consultancies probably have their own internal tools that they've done their own validations of some sort on. Every academic lab might have like a student who's building their own stuff. You have all these vendors or developers who are building something for like trying to build a real commercial tool. And it just becomes this wave of kind of unending new technology. And how do we make sense of that? And so if anyone's been in the space for a while, you might have heard Ethan Mollick talk about this jagged frontier of AI. So this is just the general idea that you could be doing a task and AI is performing at like a superhuman level. And then you could do something that's really similar and AI performs at like a subhuman level, or a totally different task or something else. And it's this idea of like, you need to figure out how to navigate this jagged frontier of capabilities in order to feel safe while using it. And that's growing. How much that covers everything you want to do is growing as the new models come and these like agent harnesses and everything else. But then there's this other piece, which is like an implementation frontier, is what I'm calling it, which is just the ability of the people who are building the tools, right? So we have tools that are getting more capable. And then we have people trying to publish something where they might not have actually done a very clever implementation and they have bad metrics, or they might have done a very clever implementation, they get great metrics. So when we see variability, is it because of the models are out of date? Is it because of variability in the implementation ability? Or are we capturing true variability in the ability of the tools? And we should all be like scared that we don't know if this is the study where we get 0.6, like 60% sensitivity, or if this is the study we get 100% sensitivity and we actually need to double check everything. In which case, why are we using this? So this is like an example of my kind of naive benchmark that I had, and then like how your naive benchmarks can trick you. So something I would always do is I was always interested in how the vision abilities improved. So I'd be like, okay, Kaplan-Meier digitization just by the vision model. Can it do it? And every model fails by a lot. And they're not really improving that much. But then really I got introduced by one of the by the AutoSR people. They kind of challenged me on this, and I had to take my lumps. But there's actually a higher skilled way of looking at this, which is a combination of traditional machine learning, traditional vision models, maybe some other things that are even fancier that are in the background, and a large language model. And now, actually, for maybe a large section of Kaplan markers, yeah, you could auto digitize them in a way that's like really quite acceptable. And now you just have to identify the ones that doesn't work in. And this sort of thing repeats everywhere. So your prompt engineering, how are you handling your full text? How are you handling the complex tables, the figures? Is your data extraction like a schema aware, where you develop a bunch of stuff up front and say, I want everything extracted this way, or is it just a free-form generation? And so I call this kind of the actual frontier of abilities, is this model capability plus the actual ability of the implementation. And so right now, we're living in this kind of self-benchmarking world in terms of the evaluations, which is we're allowing developers to benchmark themselves. I think this is super high risk of bias for obvious reasons. I don't think people are necessarily going out and trying to find the things that they're good at and only reporting that. But I do feel pretty confident that people believe the tools work and they don't realize to what degree they're optimizing for their like particular use cases. So it's very difficult to tell like what is the true performance of these tools. Publication is way too slow, so you can't wait a year to get an update on an area where things are updating every 4 months. And then there's just way too much scope. So I did some other work since 2022 at ISPOR. There's been at least, I probably missed some, 378 Gen AI presentations, 171 of those on SLR automation, and 60 preprints. This is just like not feasible to make a decision about what tool you should be using by relying on kind of the traditional peer review. So the alternatives, there might be others. These are what I found. So public benchmarks, right? This is, you have a huge benchmark that anyone can go. This is like the GPQA Diamond is like a public benchmark. Essentially, you can pay to use these. The catch is that you can just maximize your output on those. It's kind of like training to the test. And then contamination. So like a good example that was provided to me was like AS Review, which is like a traditional machine learning based screening. They have like a test training set, but it's on GitHub and it's an open source license. So you can't really use that test set because it's definitely been ingested by the models themselves at this point. So that just becomes like table stakes. You have to at least show that you're doing good on these public benchmarks. The next would be private, right? So you have like a held out test set where this could be like, maybe this is similar-ish, I think, to what Cochrane is currently doing with their platform project, where everything's being done internally. People can't just kind of submit to these. They could make their own version of it, I suppose. The issue here becomes like access and speed. You have like, if anyone's familiar with ArcAGI, which is how a lot of these, the big labs are trying to claim that they're reaching something more general as opposed to like just like a specific token predictor sort of thing in terms of like a general intelligence. So you have a public set and people can try to maximize to that all they want and help them think through problems and test to see if they're making progress. But then you have a semi-private set and you have a leaderboard that's based off that, or a private set. So you have those two things combined. And then lastly, you have like the internal bespoke sets, which would be all the things that you care about. So maybe Neil is doing a certain type of review a lot of the time, and he wants to know, well, do the tools actually work on this? This is all I really care about. I don't care how well you can summarize like a clean Pico. I want to know, can you do like X, Y, Z? Can you recognize this complexity? And then being able to have those tests internally. So I think, I mean, it's always easy to say this, but I think the solution is that public-private. We have a combo. You have shared data sets, you have leaderboards that can be updated quickly. People can compete on those, but then you have some sort of held out test maybe it's rotated to try to catch the difference between actual performance and real performance and training contamination. And so you could have something, maybe, I know a lot of people are wishing this sort of thing existed. I think we're a long way to be there, but like maybe something like you have groups of HTA organizations like CDAMC and NICE have a sort of private benchmark that you can submit to that would then say, yes, this tool passed the benchmark to this level and you can use it. Maybe that's a pie in the sky, right? And then your internal stuff, which I think is needed because that's more or less where I don't think anyone's going to cover all your specific use cases in any benchmark, especially not to the weighted to the level that you're using them. I think there's a real role for kind of traditional simulation in here, so statistical simulation. So I would do, for example, like if you have a KM tool, it's really quite easy to start to create kind of statistical manipulations of what that KM might look like. So grayscale shapes instead of solid lines, everything one color, different colors, mature, immature data, lots of censoring marks, not a lot of censoring marks. Capture where models are doing poorly on that, and then you just have kind of a small subset where you're monitoring the frontier. I think that's quite doable. So my example, this is something I do with every tool that I'm using. So I have a mini benchmark for a few different things. So I have a mixed kind of corpus of old scan PDFs, non-English articles, and supplements. I have some papers that have seemed to be tricky eligibility criteria for these models. So I have a retinopathy prematurity study that I did in the past that was on kind of pain reducing strategies. And strategies can include changing the procedure itself. So are they using a speculum to hold the eye open versus manually holding the eye open? Are they using a camera versus like a traditional route? That seems to trip up a lot of the models that I'm looking at. Having like implicit subpopulations. So maybe the article is about a subpopulation, that greater thing that you not necessarily are interested in, or maybe the paper reports like some subset of that population that you are interested in, and like overlapping study cohorts there, and then PICO variants. So good PICOs like from a Cochrane, moderate PICOs where they're not covering every use case, kind of realistic to when I was working as a grad student and just kind of doing something quick, and then things that are more exploratory. And then I have my own tests for data extraction too that try to go over the things that I care about. So can we get mixed overall and subgroup data? Can we get extract from long documents where it might be the right result might be in multiple places, but the best version is in some like deep supplement, and then some simple extraction, which is weird formatting. And so this always shows me something. I find that like a lot of the tools that I've tried so far, there's a huge variability in the performance and on these test sets for me, like massive. Depending on the tool might be like really strict on PICO criteria. So they need you to have like a super well thought out PICO. It needs to be very detailed. And some of them are more transparent about how good your PICO is than others. And I think one thing that like surprised me, for example, and this is again going to the eval, which is that the tool that had the worst published specificity that I've tried, so precision or positive predictive value, the tool that did worse there actually did the best in my tests because they've since created some new things that helped to improve that aren't captured in their benchmarks. Right. So now you have this kind of moving target, and these tools kind of help me. I think there's this this broader kind of like scope issue. It's really difficult. I know I've talked to a lot of vendors, and it can be hard for them to even get people to try the tools at times. And that's because if you're like a big review group or you're a company that does a lot of reviews, or you're a pharma company, you've probably been approached by 30 or 40 different teams at this point who are all saying that they have like the solution. They just want you to do a quick test on your data. But that quick test, if it's not set up in an automated way, is not quick at all. It takes a lot of time. And then when it disagrees with you, you do have to like reason through it and decide if you agree or not. So I think a lot of these big, more like general, like frontier model based evals are focused on this idea of like the LLM as a judge in a lot of cases. And so this can be really good for like really heterogeneous outputs, like maybe one software gives you your data extraction tables in a certain way, another a different way, another a different way, and then you have your own internal. And so can we use like the LLM as a judge to do that thinking across different formats, as opposed to having to create a pipeline that puts these all in the same way every time. And then I think, as I mentioned before, just I think there is. We haven't looked at it enough. I think there's a lot of opportunities for synthetic data to help identify more like just a few edge cases that you want to monitor, and help us understand the failure more. Like Lanny Lowe was really good on that. They mentioned essentially we don't really understand the failure modes very well. I think we can explore that more. It's one thing to have like a million reviews that you have access to, but just being able to think about, okay, here are the things that are important. Maybe I can simulate some missing components in the PICOs by taking real abstracts and deleting some aspect of that. Extraction, I think, is much easier to automate. Risk of bias, a little bit harder. Analysis might be a little bit harder as well, just in terms of like, yeah, it's one thing to get the code right, but did they make the right decision? And you have this loop. So last two slides I have. So one is just like risk-based implementation. So again, I said like there's obviously we aren't really sure where these things perform in the real life on any given test. You might have a good idea based on how it's performing on what it was evaluated on. And so I think it's probably too early to say the day of the two reviewer review is over and now you should be going to an LLM. It might be early enough to say the days of having two humans are over. Maybe you just need one human and one Gen AI powered tool. But I think it also matters where you're going. And so just the type of review, how complex it is, what are the stakes, what's the volume, right? Yeah, if I'm doing 20,000 articles, I probably don't have the human resources for that in like my group, for example. But if I'm doing 50, what's the benefit of having the AI do this for me? The expertise of the team, right? A lot of junior people, I'll talk about this in the next slide, but if you have like a ton of junior people, are they really able to disagree with the AI versus kind of a more senior team who might be able to see where these failures are, and then the timeline. So I've seen the reviews that I have seen go to NICE that are openly Gen AI, because I do believe that there probably have been some reviews going to these big organizations that are not necessarily openly Gen AI. Were based on timelines, those use cases. So they had to turn this around in a couple weeks or something. And so that tends to be what motivates people. So we have, there's this risk, I think, beyond all this, does it work? I think there's a risk of, if it works, what does it do to us, like as a field? So are we pulling up the ladder on what is one of the easiest entry level trainings for everything that comes downstream of the actual review itself? So you learn through doing. We're creating this kind of gap in training, right? Where you used to be, like when I was in grad school, you were screening with other grad students and you were having conversations and you were able to pull in a senior person who could help you. And that's how like you learned what these different things were. And so what is the training going to be now, right? If we go in this different route, and are we kind of kneecapping the juniors and saying, well, now you have to perform at this next level, like the strategy piece? We didn't give them any tools to build the strategy and like that long-term planning sort of thing. And then, I mean, I don't really know what the solution is. It's totally different to like review this output and see if you agree, is really different from making the judgment yourself, and kind of having accountability for that judgment, having to revisit and have discussions and defend it. And so from a more philosophical sense, as I promised, I'm currently reading a book by Borgman. It's a phenomenology of technology in contemporary life and where it fits. And it was written in 1984. So 1 year before I was born, it's predicting all the problems that I'm facing now. But it's this idea, and this is what I've heard from people. So technology is going to promise to free us for richer and more meaningful work. So we don't have to do this manual screening anymore. We can focus more on everything downstream. And that's the promise. But it can also just strip away all the moments that gave that work depth and meaning, and kind of allowed for the things that came after. So he calls this the device paradigm, which is that technology delivers a commodity and hides everything else as a black box. And a lot of that everything else is actually valuable. And if we don't think about it, we won't realize that. So I don't think, and I'm in a minority here, I don't think abstract screening is like busy work. I do abstract screening still. I like doing it. It's how I learn about a new field a lot of the time, and I jump around a lot. I think you notice a lot of cool things that you can think of for the future, a lot of strategic questions that come up later. are like, oh, actually, I remember there was a bunch of abstracts that touched on this and we weren't necessarily interested in it. Um, so I think there's that piece. There's that whole abstract screening, extraction as a kind of focal space where you have these discussions and you learn and you come to shared understanding of like what is the data, what were the picos, you sharpen that and your team kind of coalesces and comes to understand. I think that's an important piece. And then again, the pitch I do hear. So there's the people who are saying I can do your review super fast in 2 days, which I'm not really interested in because I'm never usually in that much of a rush. What I'm more interested in is the people who are pitching to say that, oh, we can automate the tedious part so you have more time for the analysis and interpretation. But if you look at kind of the history of humans picking up at different technologies for free for created this like new free time, we don't have a good track record necessarily of using that time to actually replace that depth and continue to build it. We usually just get rid of the thing and then add more work. And so this becomes kind of like a compounding problem. And so my kind of last big takeaway is that I think the best tools are going to find ways to maintain or like deepen these practices and not just replace them. At least that's what I hope they will do. I have my I certainly have my favorites that I think kind of help with this. But I think some people are thinking this way, other people are thinking in a totally just replacement way. And I think focusing on how do we how do we use a tool to now interact with this corpus of text in a way that we get a deeper understanding as opposed to just kind of wiping everything out. And so overall, that's the conclusion. If you aren't using an AI tool, you're probably making a mistake. If you're only using an AI tool, you're probably making a mistake. And there's tons to do on the evaluation and kind of like academic side of things. And I will end there.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was excellent and thought-provoking, as I fully expected it to be. So you have delivered from my perspective.
Oh, perfect.
So if anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand. But in the meantime, I have a question, Tim. So I'm on a couple of nice committees, and we look at a lot of AI technologies in healthcare. And a lot of these similar issues come up. For example, how do these technologies work outside the curated data sets on our more messy real world data sets, the edge cases, so on. Also, interestingly, de-skilling comes up a lot as well. I was wondering, is there anything you think you've seen that we can learn from other AI uses that might be applicable to validation of AI in these reviews? Is there anything other groups are doing which is exciting?
It's interesting because I do find that the descaling in particular is a huge blind spot for all of the AI evaluations. Everyone is just like, I mean, right before this call, I was reading that Anthropic just released the ability for me to now send from my phone, and Anthropic will use my actual computer and open up files and like do everything for me as if they were like a person there. And so I think that is a huge blind spot. Or it's just they think we're not going to be doing any of that at all anymore, and so they don't really care about creating the skill for it. They're saying this is a new paradigm, and we need to create the skills for that new paradigm. That's an argument. I don't like it. I don't think it's gonna. I don't think it really applies to us necessarily, at least in the short term. I don't think I have. I mean, the Arc AGI is probably the example of like that. Does it work in like a benchmarks versus does it work in real life? But other than that, it's just been networks of people is what I see a lot of the time. Like when the last Llama model came out, it was like the highest on all the benchmarks. And it did really well on like the LM Arena, which was where like you get presented with two different things and pick like your favorite answer. But then people started using it and were like, hey, this actually seems super dumb. It doesn't seem to match the benchmark performance. And it was like that then unraveled into what became an admission from the team that developed Llama, that they had explicitly trained on the test on like test sets where they could, that they had like explicitly trained for like for benchmark performance and like the arena performance, and that it didn't translate into real world. So maybe it would be at like private public, but then also a network of people, and we don't have like as a subspecialty, I guess, in like SLR evidence synthesis. I don't think we have like the X, Twitter, human workflow of people that care about all the things that AI was doing in general. I don't think we have that same like network that bubbles it up right away. So maybe trying to create that sort of thing.
Thank you. In terms of healthcare stuff we've been looking at, I've long thought to be very useful to have those public-private data sets for, for kind of validation. And maybe this, methods of validation is something the complex review support unit might think about as an interesting project. Catherine, I notice you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Oh, hang on. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very thought-provoking. Being an old codger, I'm not that good with things like this. Now, one of the difficulties we have with students is that they find it very difficult to define what they're going to do for their systematic review projects. And they can't seem to work out how to make a specific question using PICO criteria, and also at the same time work out whether anybody else has actually answered that question sufficiently well and sufficiently recently. So can our AI actually help students define what they're actually going to do for their projects rather than doing the projects for them once they've done it? Because if they haven't defined their projects first and they just put something rather vague into one of these models, they come out with rubbish, and you can tell that straight away. So it's like, can you use it as a teaching tool rather than as a replacement for their effort?
I've definitely seen some work in education on like tutoring applications that have shown that you can definitely use AI as a teaching tool. It can also just become like a total crutch. So like the application becomes very different. Like, do they even internalize the how to make the question piece, or do they just use it to make the question and then they go do it? Becomes like a slightly different problem. Um, I know like in my personal use cases, I often will do like have like an AI do an initial scan of the literature to see like what are the reviews in the space. And I know it's not going to be perfect, and I know it's biased in its own way. And that's another thing we didn't talk about, which is like capturing of AI's attention when you're asking it to go and do like a little TLR or something for you. The things it pulls itself are biased in a way that you have
Sorry,
no
what's a
control over.
TLR? What's a
Like
TLR?
a targeted literature review. Sorry, like just like a quick search of the literature on on a specific area.
Well, can't you
Like
just
what it
do a Google search? Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, so like that's essentially what it'll do, right? It'll do like multiple versions of Google searches and different like combinations of words, and we'll look up the citations and do
Mm.
all this work that you might not think of how it's putting the different things together. So you can build the Google skills, or you can try to ask AI to have the
Mm.
Google skills for you and do it, is essentially. But what it picks and chooses is by like its own taste, which I think is something we haven't really thought about. I
Mm.
had like as an anecdote, I was looking into kind of like, oh, if I wanted to learn about some of the formative like economic theories, like what books should I be reading? And I talked to a friend of mine who actually like, trained in economics, and he said, oh yeah, like what Claude gave you as a reading list is like a very tech bro focused set of authors, and is not necessarily what you would have gotten if you did like a proper like university education as a reading list. And so in a way it could be biasing towards kind of what the developers themselves were interested in, which I think is an interesting downstream people haven't really thought of that much.
Well, since I work in health inequalities, it's a major problem as well, as they're not trained in minority group issues at all well, because often I understand that the people who are doing the models are not from minority groups themselves, so they don't understand that what they're programming in is actually excluding people. But I don't know how
Yeah.
it would operationalize in an actual search.
Yeah, and so that might be like you might find that they perform like the search or like the Pico help or the like the ability to like find other reviews that were like relevant might vary across different types of research questions. So I don't know. It's not an area that I followed very closely. it's kind of a buyer beware sort of situation, I think. You use it, but you do it yourself also, which doesn't really help with students if you're saying they can't really do it themselves already. Um,
Great, thank you.
Right, so I've got a comment from Anna on the chat, here we go. Really enjoyable presentation. Are we maybe missing a trick by constantly trying to test the models against exact human systematic review tasks? I think there are like a whole raft of smaller activities LLMs could perform, like find the relevant part of PDF, or a whole raft of larger tasks like generating reliable, reusable metadata that might add study identification. And secondarily, what are your favorite tools? Thank you, Anna.
yes. Okay, so on your own perfect PDF. I think that's interesting. In a way, I would say a lot of the tools I've seen have some sort of like with their extraction, they'll do an extraction and like they'll link you to the relevant piece of the PDF. So I wonder if like a piece of that you could almost force it out of the current tools. You might be thinking of something different. But that would be like one thing. There is a lot of like highlighting and like linking back to PDFs as like as a general ability I see a lot of people trying to build. And the metadata, I guess like in terms of like if you're thinking like secondary research questions or I guess what would that metadata be? Just like different like design characteristics, or are you talking about like the publication metadata? But yeah, I think I will send a set of slides. Yeah. I think you're right. There is a lot of things people haven't thought of that are interesting and that are kind of like lower risk. And I think that's true of like pretty much every application of AI that I've seen. And then in terms of favorite tools, I mean, you don't have the time to test everything. I've been really happy with both Loon and Otto, but I have a previous relationship with Otto, obviously, and like I work a lot with with Loon, and I work a lot with the Otto people. So some of that can just be shaped by the fact that like it happened to jive with me, and it's not necessarily like an endorsement. It's the best tool. But I think those represent two very different philosophies on what these can look like, and I think it's worthwhile looking at them, in my opinion. But,
Thank you. Actually, going back to the earlier question, an area where it strikes me these LLMs could be useful is reviewing the scopes we come up with and having a kind of second pair of eyes on them, reviewing the protocols. Like my personal view is like the scoping is absolutely critical, and for some of the reviews we're looking at in a complex review support unit, the scoping is it's not straightforward. So as an adjunct to human review, I think that's something we should be doing. Another area I found interesting is where we're looking for economic model parameters, like studies which help describe the relationship between two variables and so on. And I found this is an area where it's hard to define kind of classical searches because the studies which are relevant may not, use phrases like surrogacy. It may not be obvious, certainly from the abstracts, even from the text. And I have had some success using LLMs to find, and it has found studies where the data imply that relationship, even though it's not called out in the text. And I found that very exciting. Is that something you've looked at, Tim?
it's very interesting. I'm glad to hear that someone else has an experience of it's very difficult to find some of these more papers that are relevant for like methodological reviews or methodological papers themselves. Um, I do find I haven't used it for that particular use case. I think based on how I've seen some of these tools and other things, I think the models are almost primed to think more of those like second order stuff at like title and abstract and like full text screening at times. Because like for example, in like one of the evals I was doing, um, the original Cochrane Pico was like I knew the authors really meant for like an eligibility criteria to be very strict. Like it had to be they weren't interested in anybody that was like treated before this time point or that were diagnosed after this time point. And I know that that was what the author meant, but their Picos were not that. And the tools were kind of surfacing these papers. It's like, oh well, if you think of it this way, like this paper actually, the median was XYZ, so this could actually be an eligible paper. And so I could see how that could extend to other things like what you're talking about, Neil, but I haven't seen any evaluations specifically of that capability.
Yeah. And it's something I would encourage people to look at. I was super impressed when I tried it. It was definitely finding papers we'd not been able to find with a kind of targeted review approach, and it understood as far as the LLMs do, it was able to contextualize the data very well. Suddenly, it found a few additional studies.
That's very
And that,
cool. Did
and
you find it also like, because I find some of the hard part can be in like getting the search itself broad enough to capture, like at least in method stuff, I find this the getting the right search terms itself is like the like, part of the hard part essentially.
yeah,
So do you find like
in
it was
fact,
helping like there also, or it was like in the actual evaluation of like whether or not this study should be
uh,
eligible, and you'd already captured all the studies?
in this particular case, we kind of had done a traditional study, and I was using it to identify potential additional studies. So we didn't look get it to look at the actual searching. We actually, it reminds me, we have a methodological study ongoing at the moment, and we're using it there because, again, we have so many hits, we need to narrow down, and we're using the LLM to help narrow down more relevant papers. And we can't, it's hard to do that with a search string itself. So I think,
Yeah.
and also I feel more relaxed in those kind of search studies. So I don't need to find every study. I just need to find a corpus of relevant, good studies. It's not like a efficacy review where there's if you miss a key study, there's a bit of a penalty for it.
Yeah, I also find like there's I'm really excited about like people who see a data extraction flow that's very like dynamic. Um, so I almost think of like the like an AI native data extraction workflow can almost be like in a way you're taking maybe a broader net than you would have, and then you're able to go and like at like a very like 10,000 foot level, see if like this relevant information might be in there, and then build up your data extraction and almost use that as a sort of like an adjunct or an alternative to some of the classical screening other senses. So you're really like exploring the entire like corpus of information at like a 10,000 foot view, and then gradually like building up a data extraction from that, and almost finding a way to exclude things that aren't relevant for you, like at that level.
Cool.
Yeah, it can be a lot of fun. It's really like exciting in the moment, but
I think so. And I think playing around
yeah.
looking at those different uses is what we ought to be doing. And I totally agree that just getting it to screen abstracts, and I don't mean that in a diminutive sense, because that's super important, is not possibly where it will give us the most value. Do we have any final questions from anybody online?
There's a message from Catherine a question from Catherine in the chat, Neil.
Excellent.
Oh, two. Yeah, these are both good ones.
Can you,
Oh, she's.
I'll let you say those, Tim, if you can see them.
Can you
Sure,
see
yeah,
them
we have
okay, Tim? I can read it out if you can't.
Do you want me to read it out? Explain the first one.
Yeah.
So it was a book, it was a systematic review comparing if you walked in a group as a social group, was it better than if you walked alone? And there were RCTs where they had two groups. One was walking and one was something else. And distinguishing the group walking in a group compared to the group walking, not necessarily in a group at all, was extremely difficult. And I'm just wondering, can AI actually distinguish those kinds of nuances in text, or are they just going to be scratching their heads same as we were?
I find that they're really good. Like some of the different tools that I've used vary in the degree to which they would help you with this type of problem and kind of surface that this is an ambiguity. And so it would be almost that it would help you like notice it earlier. I think in some cases they like the text is the text. If it's not clear in the text, I don't think it's going to be more clear for the AI than it will be for the human, unless they had something in their training data, like another paper about that.
Yeah.
The other thing here about the paper where the results don't match text and table.
Yeah.
I have not necessarily seen I think there's some like tool developers on the call, but I have not necessarily seen anyone who's really like tackled this problem of what happens when you have competing multiple results. In my experience, unless you're really clever, unless you anticipate that, or you ask for like a node or something like that, it'll often just pick one and not necessarily like in any sort of hierarchy. Um,
Because when you're writing the paper, that's one thing that you highlight is that, in this paper XXX, it's got two different sorts of results and you can't distinguish. And you try to email the authors and they haven't come back to you. So you don't actually know which one is the correct one.
yeah,
But
and I've seen that come up. I've seen that come up on like tons of, it comes up all the time, right? I've seen people who are, I do a lot of like analysis downstream of people having done data extraction. And so it'll be like, I get an analysis data set. And then I hear 2 weeks later, oh, we actually rethought this. Now we're noticing that there's different values in text tables and figures.
Mhm.
And so we've created like a hierarchy to help with that. I think unless you really, you could think like the maximalist look at this would be like, oh, I can just build my data extraction template to try to highlight these issues first. And then if they're not there, then I can go to something more, I can just go to like a generic, but if it's there, then I can look in more closely.
Mhm.
And the nice thing about like the AI tools is, in a way, if you're if you've ran into these problems before, right, and you're clever enough and you have that experience, um, you might know to kind of put this sort of thing in your data extraction form, and it might actually make you do a better job than someone who's just extracting as quickly as they can, and they just find the first mention of that value and that's what they use, and they only realize later when someone says, hey, when I read that paper I saw like a different
Mhm.
value.
Mhm.
um,
And I think that's a really important point. And again, it's something we come up with when we look at AI as an intervention in healthcare. The question isn't necessarily how it does against a panel of 3 expert radiologists with 10 years experience. The real question is how it does against the kind of jobbing radiologist at the end of a 8 hour shift. So it's that real life performance is really important. There's also a question from Anna about regarding synthetic data. How is it created?
so I think it depends on the use case. The easiest, the one I'm going to go to because I can just say that it's easy to do, is like creating actual like analysis data, right? So I could, again, the Kaplan-Meier example, I can create some realistic Kaplan-Meier curves based on fitting parametric models, or semi-parametric models to different data sets that are out there. And then I can vary what those like shape and scale and different components are and the length of follow-up and everything else. And so I can create a bunch of synthetic data sets, find where the AI fails, and then just focus on those points going forward. And I can control that the outputs of what the plots look like, and do they have high DPI, low DPI, everything else, right? Um, it's harder with other stuff. So like titled up like abstract screening, like do I use the AI to take real abstracts and just like obfuscate them a little bit? And then you have to have people agree that yes, that obfuscation was what you intended to do. And so it's much more hand wavy, I would say, there. The data extraction is the easiest, and tables and stuff like that.
So Brian Hutton's got a question around basically he's asking, are there 3 to 4 unique modifications to systematic review workflow you've seen with the growing capabilities of these tools for study section, synthesis, etc.? So is there anything specific about the workflow you think we can change?
Um, I'd say like I view the workflow as like way more iterative. So starting with your picos, doing a search, comparing it to the things you know, or like having your screening, comparing it to the articles you know should be included, having some sort of ability to look at kind of the areas where the edge cases or things that are highlighted, having that inform your picos further, and like having that be an iterative process, because now I can screen and rescreen basically infinitely, with some exceptions, and that's not a huge problem anymore. Versus before, if you had these issues pop up halfway through, it's like, oh great, now you have to rescreen everything we've already done. So you had to be really sure up front. And then I think the data extraction is the same sort of way. So you used to have to kind of think about building your full data extraction form, exactly everything you wanted to get out of it before you might do it off like 3 or 4 studies or pilot it, right? And you'd have this gigantic Excel form, and then you get to the end and like 80% of the cells are filled with NAs or NRs, versus just being able to start and build up iteratively, which only some tools allow you to do. Others just like are say, let's just extract everything. Um, but I like kind of the workflow of building up iteratively the same way as like I approach modeling. Neil, I don't know, like I start at a simple model and then I build and I build and I build and I see if I'm getting better or not. So I kind of see one potentially kind of AI native workflow as being asking it like a narrative question across all the studies. And then based off that, I might see, oh, there's some interesting things here I can pull out. And then I get maybe some different time points that I didn't realize I might be interested in. Um, and so to me, that's kind of a potential change in the workflow.
I think that's fascinating. It's also a potential change in our kind of philosophy about removing a bit of the emphasis on pre-specification. I must admit, I've always thought about these tools being used in that kind of very linear, traditional manner, but you're absolutely right. It enables you to think about doing things iteratively, as we do in many other areas. I think that's a really great point. There's another point around thanks for raising the issue about pulling up the ladder and affirming the value of screening abstracts. So that's I must admit, actually, again, this comes up in the assessments of AI in healthcare we've done. And I've always been a little bit dismissive of this idea of de-skilling on the view that, we've de-skilled ourselves throughout history with technology, but perhaps I'm being a bit too quick to dismiss those concerns. So thank you for making me take a beat and think about that.
Yeah, there is
And
that balance of I think like the Greeks said that it was a mistake for us to get away from oral traditions and have people be able to write everything down. And now it's like everything. Sure, we've lost the ability to remember these big long histories and all these things, but we're able to do so much more at the same time. So there is
uh,
like there's some tension there of like, well, maybe we don't really care about that skill in this new world that we're building. Um,
uh, as you say, there's a real philosophical element to this. Um, I'd just like to end by mentioning something what my 17-year-old daughter said, who's something of a AI LLM skeptic, which said, Dad, it's just horrendously useful at times. So I think there's a lot in that. There's a whole bunch of people saying thank you. I've got Anna saying wonderful, thank you so much. I'd just like to echo that. Thank you, Tim, for coming, and also thank you everybody in the audience for attending. So thanks for a very successful and thought-provoking seminar.